The views and content expressed on the Pop Culture Courtroom are provided solely for educational and entertainment purposes and do not constitute legal advice. For any legal matters, please consult with a licensed attorney.
Welcome back to the Pop Culture Courtroom. I'm Matt Hardin.
And I'm William Mayfield.
Here on the Pop Culture Courtroom, we look at movies, TVs, and books as to whether or not someone that's been injured in one of those pop culture items has a particular court case, and then we debate that.
So today we're going to be talking about The Office. The Office is my favorite television show of all time. I think it really changed the way that comedies were done. It does not have a laugh track, which is really unique, and it was a workplace comedy. Essentially having a documentary. It's not really a documentary, but they're pretending to have a documentary. And they're just following around people at work and the funny situations that come about. Now, of course, it's a television show, so a lot more funny situations arise than probably would happen in a natural workplace. But it's supposed to be a documentary of people working at a paper company.
And that's going to play a role later on when we have a talk about today's episode.
So we're actually going to fast forward to season 4. The boss, Michael Scott, Steve Carell, is known for hijinks. You know, he's in charge, but he's somehow possibly the most irresponsible person at the company. He really thinks he has everything figured out all the time, but in general, he doesn't. And he gets himself into a lot of kind of awkward but funny positions. We're going to talk about that a little bit in our irrelevant evidence later. But in this situation, he's on the way to work, and he is talking about how it's going to be a great year, going on and on about how everything is awesome. And he drives into the parking lot, and he's just looking at the camera, and he strikes an employee, Meredith Palmer, with his car, and she kind of rides up the windshield, and they cut to his face, and he is obviously mortified. And we'll talk a little bit more about the scene from there.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that I would throw in about that. We've got Meredith that's at the work parking lot. She's at the workplace. She's going in. So before we get into the issues, I'd say as a background, Meredith has a drinking problem on the show. And as I recall, she's often shown actually drinking at work. Is that right?
From time to time, how much of that varies. It was, presumably the morning, like, 8:30 or 9 or something like that. And they don't bring that up whether or not she was drunk at that time. But if she was, that would play a role.
Well, and I can tell you this, they 100% at a hospital after a wreck like this, or close to 100%, are going to take blood and see whether or not that person has alcohol, if there's any kind of smell of alcohol around them.
So one thing that came to mind when I was watching this scene that I think everybody out there could learn from is, unfortunately, in Michael's case, they have video of this. Unfortunately, there are people out there, and we've seen it, who will get in a wreck and they'll tell you, I'm sorry, this was my fault. But then when the cops come around or they're talking to their insurance company, they change their tune. And I think it wouldn't be a bad idea for anyone who would consider it to have a dash cam in their car, because then you have evidence of what actually happened, and takes the he said, she said out of it a lot of the times if you can have that dash cam on there. Certainly not the purpose of the documentary crew for Michael, but it ended up being a situation where Michael couldn't explain himself out of this one, because he, to me at least, was clearly at fault for this.
I agree with him. I mean, I think that dash cams are pretty inexpensive. In the cases that we end up having camera. It makes it really difficult for somebody to lie about what happened, and unfortunately, not everybody out there lives their life with honor in the way that they should.
And Michael has kind of a funny. Fortunately, Meredith did end up being. She had some issues. She had some injuries, but she ended up being okay long term. But Michael goes to tell the office about this incident, and he says it in a way. He first reports that Meredith had been hit by a car, and he says that the hospital tried to save her life. And they did. And it was just an awful way. It implied basically that she had passed away. And Stanley said, "Why did you phrase it like that?" But they start asking Michael questions like, "Oh, how'd you hear about this?" and whatnot. And he's like, "Well, I happened to be in the car that hit her." And so they're like, they all know Michael pretty well at this point. It's season 4. And they go, "Did you hit Meredith with your car?" at which point he admits to that and then immediately starts giving excuses or things that could maybe minimize what happened. But in reality, it was a pretty serious situation because Meredith ended up in the hospital.
Well, Meredith had a pelvic fracture. That's a serious injury, often will require surgery. And if you get a younger person, that could affect their, somebody that's a teenager or younger, you could actually have your growth plate affected by that kind of injury, and it can affect things later. And for young women, it could affect, giving birth and being able to carry children. So it's a very serious injury that she has. So as I remember, Michael goes and then reports it. At that point, I think Ryan had been promoted and he's working at the corporate office. And what I found amusing about that is Ryan immediately thinks that Michael did it on purpose. So how does it affect things as far as the insurance coverage if Michael did this on purpose?
Well, that's a really good point. So most insurance companies, they don't cover car wrecks that are done on purpose. So we see this come up in road rage sometimes, where if someone was yelling at someone and then runs them off the road, that's not the type of reason that insurance exists. That's not what they're trying to cover. They're trying to cover accidents for the most part. That's why it's so important that you have your own uninsured motorist coverage, because if you get hit by someone intentionally, or it's just something that's outside the scope of what their insurance company covers, if you don't have your own uninsured motorist coverage, you're likely not going to have anywhere to recover from.
So in looking at, the liability for this particular case, it all starts with Michael. We've got Michael, who's ultimately liable for this crash. I think the more interesting question is whether or not Dunder Mifflin is going to have liability for this crash.
Yes. Now, we know from those of you who've watched The Office that Michael is very proud of his company car, the Sebring, which is a convertible, and he lives in Connecticut. He lives in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Stamford, Connecticut is another branch. But he lives in Pennsylvania, and he has a convertible, which maybe not the most practical choice. But he does have a company car. And we discussed this a little bit before we got on this pod. We are not workers' compensation lawyers, but there certainly could be a workers' comp claim. Some of that would depend on, who actually owned that parking lot and other questions like that. But
would she be considered that she was at work at a time that she was walking from her car? Now, the interesting part about both for a particular comp claim and liability for me is we have this documentary crew that clearly has been there for years and years. And why are they there? I mean, do they have the hopes that's going to help Dunder Mifflin sell more paper? Probably. I mean, can you think of?
Yeah, it's tough because so in the last season, the documentary is eventually shown on what is, I guess, the fictional version of PBS. They were trying to make money themselves, even if I assume that Dunder Mifflin either made money from allowing the documentary crew to be there, or they got publicity from the documentary actually happening. But I'm sure Dunder Mifflin made money. And then the documentary crew themselves also made money on the production itself. The story gets a little bit murky because Dunder Mifflin ownership kind of changes hands a couple times over the show, and the documentary just keeps on going like nothing happened. But
well, I mean, whether Meredith is in the parking lot, I think kind of a central question is with this blessing from the corporate office that this documentary crew is following around. I mean, they're at Michael's apartment often in this, including this episode. So is he on company business while the documentary crew is there? I would argue yes. I mean, he's talking about what's going on at the company. So I think when you sue, you've got Michael in first place with whatever car insurance he has, likely, which is paid for since it's a company car, also by Dunder Mifflin. So that tends to lend some credence to that. There'll probably be a bigger policy here for Meredith's substantial injury.
I would agree with that. I think that the car insurance policy is likely to be a fairly large one since it's a company policy. We know that the Sebring is owned by Dunder Mifflin, and company policies generally tend to be higher than personal policies. That's not always the truth, but it's kind of a general rule of thumb.
Well, and you've got the documentary crew too. They're filming him and what he's saying in his car while driving, which is frankly a distraction. So we've talked about comparative fault before in Tennessee, where essentially a jury can put fault on more than one person. So in this case, Dunder Mifflin is going to be responsible for what Michael Scott does with this wreck as their employee, or what we call their agent. I think the documentary crew probably gets sued as well, and then it comes back to the question, you as a plaintiff, the person who's seeking compensation for your injury, you can have fault too. So if, Meredith showed up at the hospital and she actually had some alcohol in her system that shows up, she potentially could have some fault for this. And the way that works is if you say get a $100,000 verdict and they find Meredith is 10% at fault, it reduces what you get by that amount.
Meredith's injury in terms of recovery is likely to be pretty substantial. She spent multiple days in the hospital. Those overnight hospital stays are very expensive. And in Tennessee, we have what's called the collateral source rule, which is where you are to be paid the charged amount of your medical bills, whether any other source pays for those bills or not, whether it's a discounted rate from health insurance or something like that. The jury is instructed not to consider that. They're to consider that you owe the entirety of your medical bills. Well, I can tell you a 6 or 7 night stay in the hospital is not going to be cheap.
No, she's going to have substantial bills and likely has had a surgery, so it's probably a 6-figure amount. Probably the easiest way to understand the collateral source rule without getting too in the dredge of law is that you as a good citizen who pays for your own health insurance or have paid taxes to get your government insurance, you should get the benefit of that, not the person who's harmed you due to their negligence.
I totally agree. Another issue that comes up later on in this episode is that they figure out that Meredith has rabies. Now, in our practice, we have complications come up a lot where, let's say someone had an injury prior to a wreck, and then they got in a wreck and they had an injury that was somewhat similar to a pre-existing condition or something like that they had before. And it can really muddy the waters on, well, what did the wreck actually cause, and what of these medical records of these injuries and in these medical records and of these bills is actually related. Well, here it's obviously clear that Meredith's rabies didn't come from getting hit by a car, but it's a good opportunity to kind of talk about those issues.
Well, Meredith, according to this episode, has been bit by a bat, a rat, and a raccoon during her life in the recent years. The bat one's the most interesting one for what we're talking about because that bat was found in the office itself, caught on video, and Dwight catches the bat with a plastic bag over her head, and that's when she gets bit. So that definitely probably is a workers' comp injury for that. But ultimately, does it have anything to do with her pelvic injury? Probably not.
No, I would say so. Michael actually goes on to, and this is an interesting defense that I've not seen from any defense attorneys. He tries to spin it to where the car wreck potentially saved Meredith's life because they discovered this rabies, which was easily curable, and then he has a kind of expensive fun run for the cure for rabies, which had already been cured. And the whole office spends a day running to cure rabies. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with Michael that the wreck was a good thing for Meredith's life.
Absolutely not. And the fun run I think ends up only raising a few $100s because he spends most of it on the presenter and the giant check.
And I think most of that came from his girlfriend, Jan. So something the office does great is find a way to waste time in a beautiful way. And that was what they did there.
Well, and essentially the big reveal of these couple episodes is that we find out that Jim and Pam are dating, for those of you that like love out there.
I actually did not start watching The Office live until season 5, so I saw that on a binge rewatch, but I've probably watched it 15 or 20 times, and I still get a little excited because they've been leading to that for 3 or 4 seasons. As far as whether there's a case or no case, I think Matt and I are probably going to agree on this one, that the primary liability is going to go to Michael, but that you should certainly include Dunder Mifflin in your lawsuit as well as the camera crew. I personally think, even though it's going to be a fairly large claim, that it is pretty likely that Michael's policy with the company car will have enough insurance money to cover it.
And if they don't, we know Dunder Mifflin has multiple branches. They're not really shutting branches down at this point yet. I think.
At this point, no.
But they have substantial, probably assets, along with whatever liability insurance they have. And given the amount of people we see in their corporate office, and I suspect there's a lot of funds there. Let's talk about one more thing with the comp I wanted to mention. So in Tennessee and in most states, workers' comp will pay for your whatever injuries for life if you have them. So it's often good to check out whether or not you have that coverage, because your health insurance may not cover everything for you. And then there's an interplay really between those two companies.
Right. So in Tennessee and probably in all states, we practice in Tennessee and Kentucky, so I know about those two. But you can't have what's called double recovery. So if workers' comp pays for your injuries on the front end, but then you receive a lump sum payment from a car insurance company on the back end, you're going to owe back workers' comp the portion that they paid up to that point.
Typically, there's one exception for that that's interesting, which is when there's a car wreck involved in your injury, at least in Tennessee, the workers' comp cannot come in if you're using your uninsured motorist protection, meaning that you have coverage to make sure the person that hit you, that there's money to get at whether or not they're insured or not.
So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of this particular, before we get to our irrelevant evidence, would be a point that Matt brought up earlier, which would be comparative fault. It's hard to tell exactly where this happened, but it really looks like it happened very close to the entrance. And something I've thought about for years is, why was Meredith walking there? It's not okay for Michael to not be looking at the road. It's not okay for him to be looking directly to an interview crew. It's probably borderline okay for him to be doing an interview at all while he's driving.
Borderline not okay.
Or borderline not okay, yeah. But I still, to this day, don't know why Meredith would be walking directly in the entryway when cars are very likely to be there.
That's called a plot device way.
Yeah, I understand.
I mean, there's some ridiculous things in this episode we've not even talked about. I mean, this is the episode that Dwight kills Angela's cat, her sickly cat, Sprinkles. And then when she actually when he gets to the hospital to go visit Meredith, he thinks about pulling the plug on her.
She's sitting there fully conscious saying, "Don't pull the plug." I think there is comparative fault on Meredith. I think the question would be, as a defense attorney, do you want to get up in front of a jury and blame someone who's been struck by a car by someone who was clearly negligent for this terrible situation that they've gone through? Do you think that's going to go over well with a jury?
I don't really think Meredith's going to get much comparative fault related to that issue, because it's, to me, a lot of times these cases are found on what the story is. And the story here is that Michael is, distracted by the film crew in his own car and causes these injuries. And she's walking in a parking lot to go to work. So absent, having alcohol in the system, I think she's going to come out pretty well in this case.
I would agree. So, case or no case?
100% a case, and frankly, a case I'd love to have. I mean, Michael Scott, on video throughout this episode, takes virtually no responsibility for it, tries to deflect from it. And, I think, I've talked about this before. You love this show. I like this show. I like the show when it's the good Michael, the Make the Better World place. When the version of this Michael is closer to the Ricky Gervais version from the British Office, which I've also watched and is very good. It's got, a couple of pretty prominent actors in it with it, which is, Ricky Gervais, Martin Freeman, who played Bilbo Baggins in the Hobbit movies, and Mackenzie Crook, who's been in a bunch of things like Pirates of the Caribbean, a great character actor.
Well, Michael's a pretty flawed character, but he really cares about what people think about him. And oftentimes when he's trying to diffuse a situation or to kind of get out of a situation, he makes things even worse. And The Office is known for being very funny, but also having some really uncomfortable, kind of cringy type situations. And so that's what we're going to talk about in our irrelevant evidence today. And we're going to specifically talk about them as they relate to Michael Scott and other folks at Dunder Mifflin. So I will start with...
Are these our top 5 cringe moments of Michael Scott?
That's correct. And so I will start with one where Phyllis Vance, she is famously engaged to and then marries Bob Vance of Vance for Refrigeration, which he likes to always tell people. And she puts him in her wedding because I believe she wanted a 6-week honeymoon or 6 weeks vacation or something a large amount of vacation or time for her honeymoon. And she puts him in her wedding, and that wouldn't work in most situations, but Michael's immaturity and just desire to be liked actually played right into it. So he was all about being in her wedding. And Phyllis's dad is handicapped, and Michael pushes him down the aisle in a wheelchair. And he actually gets up and walks the last little bit to go to his spot. And it's a really touching moment. But Michael definitely views it like his spotlight had been taken away. And that leads to Bob and Phyllis getting married. And the preacher asks one of them to say, "I do." And then Michael jumps out there trying to get the spotlight and goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. Vance." And everyone is quiet because the other person needs to finish that. And then she does, and everyone cheers, and Michael does it again, even though he's just gone through this horribly awkward, silent situation. And so one of my groomsmen swore to me that he was going to do that. Shout out Brett Hamlin. I was nervous until we got done that was going to happen. And I've been in a few weddings with him since, and he says he's going to do it every time. He never has, thank goodness. But really funny but awkward moment.
So the second one was when Michael grills his foot on a George Foreman grill that he has in his bedroom. And he essentially explains it as he likes waking up to the smell of bacon. I mean, I think lots of us do. Bacon's the best. But he basically wraps it up and really tightly, goes to work, and then spends the day complaining about it. Well, we get another car wreck in this episode. Mm-hmm. Dwight Schrute actually hits a pole on the way to work, clearly has a concussion, throwing up. Michael makes it about himself throughout and prides his own health, but he's not doing anything about it. So ultimately, as I remember, Ryan sneaks some medicine into Michael's yogurt, eats it, and makes him feel better. But then ultimately they take Dwight, I think, to the hospital. He's got getting an MRI done, and during the MRI, Michael's trying to stick his burned foot in there to get it checked out. It's just ridiculous.
It was. He wanted to wake up to the smell of crackling bacon, which is the crackling you would hear anyway. And he would put it on the grill like 2 hours. He would wake himself up, put it on the grill 2 hours before, and then wake up. But the whole episode, he's acting like it's the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone, and it's really something he should have been embarrassed about, not trying to get sympathy for, especially when someone clearly has a concussion. So
well, and there's probably an argument, some liability from Dunder Mifflin again, since their manager is preventing an employee from getting care for a concussion, which is not something you want to delay. I mean, you may have a brain bleed or something like that, and blood in the brain is almost like acid, so it's really important to get care right away.
Yeah, my dad was in medical sales, and he's told me he can't even hardly watch the show because every episode there's something that would get someone fired, or it just wouldn't work out the way that it was. But a lot of creative license. The third irrelevant evidence I'd like to talk about today is when Michael is interviewing for the corporate job at the end of season 3. He is simply given an interview, and he is so confident that he is going to get that job that he goes ahead and makes all of these plans. And the biggest of which is he, after doing this almost Olympics-style competition on a beach day, which went horribly, gives the job to Dwight Schrute. And anyone who's watched the show would know that that's essentially like telling Dwight Schrute he's going to be king of the world. It's all he's ever wanted his entire life. And he gives him the job. He sells his house on eBay. And we later figure out that he sold it at 80%, and it sold in record time. It's an appreciating asset. And he goes and does the interview, and it's a complete disaster. He doesn't even realize that the job he's interviewing for is to replace his girlfriend and boss, Jan. The person interviewing him at corporate tells him that and says, "Do not tell her." And he immediately goes and tells her. She storms in there. It's a whole mess. He is not even considered for the job. And then he has to come back and take back his old job from Dwight. Dwight believed that Michael had moved on. And so the whole thing is horribly awkward, and but it kind of puts a nice wrap on season 3.
All right. The fourth one involves Michael and driving again. There's an episode where Michael drives his car into a lake, and it's one where Ryan has been trying to push the modern technology of Blackberries and the like on the staff, and Michael's really pushing back on that. So during the episode, he's trying to get lost clients back by driving around with gift baskets, which does not work. And ultimately, the GPS directs him to, I'm sure we've all been here, where GPS takes you in a weird direction. Michael ends up driving into a lake with his car and looks at it as somehow a repudiation of the technology, when it just shows his own foolishness, frankly.
It wasn't like the lake was hidden. The lake was right there. Dwight saying, "There's a lake there." And Michael just drives right in it, and he thinks it absolutely vindicates him.
Well, and one of the funnier parts about it is he's actually in a rental car from when he got in the wreck with Meredith, and what's the subject of our podcast today, and instead of his company car. So hopefully the company insurance will pay for that. Whenever you go out and rent a car, you should definitely make sure that your own car insurance covers rental cars, because sometimes it doesn't, and you should be buying that insurance with the rental.
Absolutely. The fifth piece of irrelevant evidence is probably the most famous cringeworthy moment in all of The Office, and it's brilliantly written but hard to watch. And it's the episode called Scott's Tots. Michael is an overconfident guy. He has a different perception of himself than probably other people do of him. And I guess early on in his business career, he went to visit some children in kind of a low-income area at their school. And he told them that he was going to pay for all of their college. And of course, at the time that he made that promise, he didn't have that money. And believe it or not, 7 to 10 years later, whenever this is, he is nowhere close to having that money. So the time has come. There was a newspaper article about it back then, and the time has come for that to happen. And they're all graduating, this class, and so they invite him back, and they make up this song for him called "Hey, Mr. Scott, what you gonna do? What you gonna do? Make our dreams come true." And they all start singing that for him, and they're hailing him like he's a king, and he knows that he is about to disappoint all of them. So he gets up there and starts giving a speech, and the bell rings, and he's like, "Oh, everybody can go." He just wants out of it. They're like, "No, it's a double period. We're fine." So he ends up breaking the news to them by telling him that intuition is really important, and then asks them if they have any idea what's about to happen. And he breaks it to them that he's not going to be able to pay for their college, and all the teachers and the kids and everyone is obviously up in arms. And he goes, "Well, but if you do go to college, you are going to need a laptop." So the kids, they think, okay, at least, we are at least going to get a laptop out of this. And he goes, "And you can't use those laptops without batteries." And he brings out laptop batteries. And everyone is livid, and it is just absolutely terrible. One of the students ends up talking to him afterwards and saying that wasn't a very nice thing to do. And he pays for that student's books, but he does it with checks written to not be cashed, once every year. And so he does end up paying $4,000 or $5,000 towards this, but I would imagine the tuition would have been much more substantial than that.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
That's pretty bad. So, well, that'll do it for our Office episode of the Pop Culture Courtroom.
Thanks for stopping by and listening to our podcast today. We'll see you next time.
The Pop Culture Courtroom is a Matt Hardin Law production.
If you've been involved in a car wreck or any other type of personal injury or wrongful death case, check us out at matthardinlaw.com or give us a call at 615-200-1111.